Hi there, welcome to this episode of the Cutting Room Floor. This is a segment where I get to go a little deeper or follow up on a recent message here from Sunny Slope Church. Maybe get into some of the details of a passage that we just didn't have time to dig into in our normal message on a Sunday morning. Yesterday, or this past week anyways, we looked at a story from the Old Testament. We looked at a story about a prophet named Hosea and his wife Gomer. Now, this is a love story in so many sort of tragic ways. It's a love story between two people, and Gomer does not, she's unfaithful, and God tells Hosea to marry her nonetheless. And as you might imagine, this has raised a lot of questions especially in academic circles, but even in broader circles. One of those questions being, how in the world would God, and maybe why in the world, and how could God command a prophet to marry a prostitute or an unfaithful woman? How could God orchestrate and arrange this marriage? Like, what is God doing bringing together a prophet with someone who is so promiscuous, and how could that marriage be sanctioned by God? And I think that's a really good question. It's a question that has, over time, especially in academic circles, has been a number of different answers have been proposed that I think are kind of interesting, but I think they ultimately fall short. And I think there's actually something important here. So in academic circles, some of the answers go something like this. Well, God told Hosea to marry Gomer. But when God orchestrated that marriage, Gomer was a very chaste woman. She was an upright, decent woman. It was only after the couple was married that Gomer began to stray outside of the marriage. And so something happened in the course of marriage or in the course of their life that led Gomer to stray from the marriage. That's a possibility, but I think it's an unlikely one. That I think what it's trying to do is, well, I think, I'll get into why in a second, but that's an unlikely possibility. The second possibility that's been suggested is that Gomer, when it says that Gomer was an adulterous woman, really what it was saying was that she was spiritually adulterous. So the second theory goes something like this: Gomer was not so much sexually unfaithful to Hosea. It's not like she went and had an affair, but really the problem was more that she worshiped different gods, and she was from a pagan background, and so she remained committed to Hosea, she remained committed to the marriage, but she, spiritually speaking, she had other beliefs that she chased after. The third theory, so if the first theory is that Gomer was a good woman who was corrupted later on and became unfaithful later on, the second theory is that Gomer was really it was physically and maritally she was faithful, but spiritually she was unfaithful. The third theory is that all of this is really just a legend. It was an extended parable that God revealed to Hosea and sort of Hosea put it in literary form, almost like you would write a play or an opera today. And so really what you have is not God actually commanding a man named Hosea to marry a woman named Gomer, but you have God coming to the prophet Hosea and really inspiring him to write this theatrical production that communicated the message. So the message remains the same, but the biographical details are actually fictitious. They didn't really happen. Now, why these theories? What is it that prompts what is it that prompts people to come up with these alternative theories rather than the most straight up reading of the text, which is that God did indeed command a man named Hosea to marry an unfaithful woman named Gomer? I think there's a couple things. I think there's two factors at work. One of them is there is a long history of avoiding some of the graphic and dramatic and explicit realities in the Bible. The Bible is actually it's a very graphic book. It's a book filled with explicit content, explicit material. It's a book filled with bloodshed and violence in ways that we probably wouldn't want our kids exposed to. And there's a part in us, I think, that wants to sanitize the message of the Bible. We want to actually clean it up and make it more palatable. One example is the book of Song of Songs, which is an incredibly erotic and explicit book, especially if you begin to understand what a lot of the imagery points to. And it's interesting that throughout much of great periods of church history, there was a tendency to completely allegorize the entire book. And so rather than having this be very graphic and explicit love poetry about the sexual love between a man and a woman, it turned into this extended picture of Christ and the church, and all of the imagery was cleaned up and spiritualized so that it referred more to like the sacraments or to the law and the Ten Commandments and so on and so forth. There's this tendency to say there's no way that God could possibly intend to have this kind of graphic language in the Bible. And so there was a tendency to clean it up. The other reason, I think, is that there's a tendency and a desire to avoid difficult questions, like to picture that God's will would include Hosea marrying an unfaithful woman. That's a difficult reality to come to grips with. We want to assume that God is sort of disconnected from those realities, that God wouldn't have that in his will. God wouldn't desire that. Here's my response to that. If you read through the book of Hosea, there is plenty of material in the story that would strongly make the case that this was indeed a historical event. In other words, that God really did come to a man named Hosea. One of the ways we know that is there's a lot of biographical detail given. Hosea's family lineage is given. Gomer's lineage is given. The place of their marriage and relationship is given. So all of this, you wouldn't find that especially in Hebrew poetry and in Hebrew writing, you wouldn't find that in there normally. And so I think the way that and to be clear, in the book of Hosea there certainly is poetry. Some of the story is told in poetic form, but there's also biographical information that's in there that really you wouldn't have in literature unless it was actually historical information. The other reason I think we know that this is true, and the other reason I think we can rely on this story is as an actual event, as an actual historical event, is that if this was an allegory, you begin to lose the message. If you say, well, God's love is like a man who marries an unfaithful woman, but by the way, this never really happened, that diminishes the impact of the book. That's kind of like, then you can just invent anything, any event, and say, well, that's what God is like, and it loses the impact. But when you actually see that it's acted out in front of you, the message then packs a punch. The message becomes more relatable and believable. Here's why I think this matters. If you clean up the story of Hosea and Gomer, and you try to sanitize it and allegorize it and spiritualize it, what we actually end up doing is we end up sort of cleaning up ourselves. We are trying to make ourselves look better than we really are. We're trying to sort of say, well, we're not really, Gomer was not really as bad as she appeared. And then the message becomes, well, we're not really as bad as we appear. And then in doing that, you actually begin to diminish God, because you end up with a story in which Hosea doesn't get his hands dirty with this prostitute and this unfaithful, immoral woman. And then the message becomes, well, the God of the universe doesn't really get his hands dirty either. But when we keep the story intact, and when we begin to rely on it as an actual historical event, the vivid message comes clear. And that is that the gospel is a story of God's persistent and faithful love directed at a people who do not deserve it, who have not earned it, who have not worked for it, and in fact have done everything in their power to resist and to reject that love. And yet that's the kind of God that we have. We have a God who gets his hands dirty, who gets his life messy, who jumps into the mess of the realities of this world in order to love us back into relationship with himself. The historicity of this story matters because it's a pointer to the ultimate love story, which is God's love for us demonstrated at the cross. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. And don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and leave a comment. We'll see you next time.